It happened on a Monday morning in the heart of Pinecrest Oaks, a neighborhood once praised for its neatly trimmed lawns, squeaky clean sidewalks, and unanimous sense of peace. I wish I could say it was just another day of small talk over fences, homemade pies on doorsteps, and the usual routine of middle-aged folks exchanging retirement advice. But that morning, the unthinkable changed everything. I was power walking down Maple Bend with my neighbor, Gloria Jenkins. She's the sort of person who stops to coo over every puppy that crosses her path. So our walks always took longer than planned, but I didn't mind. Exercise was secondary to the camaraderie of strolling among neighbors. That's when we saw Mr. Henderson, Harold Henderson, collapsed on his driveway across the street. His eyes were half closed, face drained of color. Not a soul else in sight. Time seemed to freeze. All I remember next was dashing to him, calling Gloria to phone 911, and kneeling down to administer CPR. I'd taken a refresher course at the community center just last year. My heart pounded with equal parts adrenaline and dread as I compressed his chest, counting under my breath. In those precious seconds, all that existed was the hope of forcing life back into his lungs. Then a voice, the unmistakable, imperious tone that every resident at Pinecrest Oaks recognized, cut through the air like a whip. It was our HOA President, Edward Ed Callahan, striding up in his polished dress shoes and crisp iron polo. "Stop," he barked, waving his arms as though we were in some comedic act. "You can't do that here." I paused mid-compression, thinking perhaps I misheard him, but he repeated himself, ordering us, to cease CPR immediately. I couldn't fathom the logic. A man lay dying, and our HOA President was forbidding intervention, repeating the word liability in the same breath as though that served as reason enough. Gloria, her phone pressed to one ear, stared at Ed in shock. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked. "He's dying. This is an emergency." But Ed was adamant, his eyes bulging. "We have strict neighborhood policies about untrained residents administering medical care on HOA property. Liability issues, insurance coverage. Stop CPR right now, or you can make things worse for all of us." My hand shook. For a moment, the fear of doing further harm collided with the knowledge that Mr. Henderson's life was slipping away. I had at least some training, the basic kind, but training nonetheless. Ed's insistence made no sense. Even so, he was the kind of man who exuded authority at every turn, who rarely hesitated to remind you he'd been president of our HOA for nearly a decade. He once bragged that he knew every ordinance, local and state, by heart. And although his repeated mention of liability sounded half-baked, it sent a jolt of confusion through me. I got in 3 more compressions, defying his order, before Ed physically pulled me back. My heart hammered in protest. I was caught between the moral imperative to save a life and the bizarre demands of a man with a gavel. Gloria was screaming in her phone by that point, yelling at the 911 operator, "He's not breathing. And this man wants us to stop CPR." Everything felt surreal. I remember Mr. Henderson's slack face, the way the morning sun glinted off his forehead. I remember the scuff on Ed's shoe as he nudged me aside. Then the paramedics arrived, pushing Ed out of the way with professional detachment. They quickly resumed CPR, loaded Mr. Henderson onto the stretcher, and sped off in their ambulance, sirens wailing. But the damage was done. By the time the paramedics' efforts concluded, Harold Henderson was declared dead at the scene. They couldn't find a heartbeat. I stood dumbfounded, as if I'd walked out of my comfortable suburban bubble into a war zone of swirling moral and legal chaos. Ed looked rattled, but clung to whatever justification he believed in, something about the HOA's best interests. The neighbors came out of their houses, gathering in small clusters on sidewalks. Whispered questions drifted. Why would Ed forbid CPR? On what grounds? Could Harold Henderson have been saved? No one had answers, not even me or Gloria, who had been there from the beginning. We only had heartbreak and a searing realization. The neighborhood was about to change irreparably. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea. Sleeplessness pressed down on me. I replayed the sequence, my hands on Harold's chest, Ed's booming voice, the paramedics' arrival, wondering if an extra minute or two of uninterrupted compressions might have brought him back from the brink. Did Ed's interruption seal Harold's fate? That question lodged itself in my mind, heavy as a stone. I knew, with a somber certainty, that this wasn't over. The next day, a rumor swirled that the Henderson family might take legal action, fueling speculation about whether the HOA, or even me, might be sued. But in the hush of that night, all I could think about was the look on Harold Henderson's face the moment he slipped away. The following week at Pinecrest Oaks was anything but serene. Word traveled faster than a morning paper, and Harold Henderson's death sat like a lead weight on the community's collective conscience. No one could quite look one another in the eye without acknowledging the sour truth. Something was fundamentally broken in our neighborhood's leadership. By Tuesday morning, our resident social media group exploded with accusations, outrage, and attempts to make sense of what happened. Some folks vilified Ed, calling for his immediate resignation. Others tried to play devil's advocate, insisting we didn't have all the facts. Maybe the HOA has a reason for these rules, they said, as if conjuring an invisible, rational explanation might help them sleep at night. A community meeting was called in the clubhouse that Thursday evening. Normally, these monthly get-togethers were polite gatherings where neighbors politely sipped coffee and listened to Ed drone on about landscaping guidelines and the new paint schemes allowed on front doors. The seats were usually half-filled, with many skipping out entirely because the subject of lawn heights and holiday decoration schedules rarely set hearts aflutter. But not this time. This time, the entire clubhouse was packed. People stood along walls, fanned themselves with folded HOA newsletters, and shot nervous glances at each other. It reminded me of a tense town hall right after a major scandal. As I entered with Gloria, a hush fell over the crowd. Then a subdued murmur picked up. People recognized us instantly, the ones who tried to save Harold. You'd think we were heroes, but I felt only guilt that I hadn't somehow pushed Ed aside from the start and performed CPR until the ambulance arrived. Then again, the rational side of me knew I'd done all I could. On the stage at the front of the clubhouse, behind a row of plastic tables, sat the HOA board. Ed in the middle, stiff as a board, flanked by 4 other members who wore matching expressions of anxiety. Normally, Ed's presence took command. That night, however, an air of uncertainty wrapped around him. He tapped his pen on the table, refusing eye contact with the crowd. The meeting opened, ironically, with a moment of silence for Harold Henderson. People bowed their heads, and I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes. The hush was deafening. A gust of wind rattled the old windows. Then the board tried to proceed with mundane agenda items, approving last month's minutes, budgetary notes, the usual. The audience rustled, growing restless. Finally, an elderly resident named Barbara, hair neatly coiffed, stood up and addressed the board with a trembling voice. "Mr. Callahan, we need an explanation. Why did you order CPR to stop?" Barbara's question rang in the stale air. Ed's jaw tightened. I watched him shift in his seat, clearing his throat before speaking into the microphone. "We have bylaws to protect everyone's safety," he began, his voice carefully measured. "I'm aware some people think I did something unconscionable. But please understand our insurance policy." A wave of dissent rippled through the crowd before he could finish. "Insurance policy?" hollered a man in the back. "That's the reason you let our neighbor die?" The board members looked rattled. Ed's face went from stern to flustered as he rushed out a feeble defense about liability clauses, disclaimers in our resident guidelines, and how untrained medical intervention could pose a risk to the community. His voice grew shrill as he insisted he was acting in Pinecrest Oaks' best interests. At that point, fury welled up in me. I stood abruptly, ignoring Gloria's gentle tug at my sleeve. "I'm not a doctor, but I'm certainly not untrained," I said, voice louder than I intended. "CPR classes are offered at the community center. Remember? The ones our HOA newsletter recommended for preparedness? I took one. How can that be considered untrained? And even if I hadn't, Harold Henderson needed help. You demanded we stop. That's inhumane." The crowd erupted in applause. A few people even stood up and cheered. In that one moment, I felt the weight of so many neighbors behind me, surging with frustration. We wanted answers, and more importantly, we wanted accountability. Ed grimaced. He tried to retort, but the crowd's swelling indignation drowned him out. Another wave of voices pressed for his resignation. Yet some lingered on the fence, too fearful of potential legal repercussions to pick a side. That's how powerful the HOA's grip was. Many believed rocking the boat might jeopardize their property values or subject them to fines. The Pinecrest Oaks Board had historically lorded power over the residents, controlling everything from garden gnome placement to mailbox design with strict, sometimes petty consequences for noncompliance. In the midst of the rising tempest, a soft voice spoke out behind me. It was Harold's widow, Lorraine Henderson, dressed in black. She clutched a tissue, her eyes rimmed red. Harold was a father, a grandfather, a friend. All he needed was help. And instead, I have to plan a funeral. She choked on her words, and the entire room felt her heartbreak. I turned to see her face, etched with grief. I'd known her as a stoic woman, but that night, the sorrow cracked through any composure she might have tried to maintain. Ed tried to respond, but a hush fell over him, as if words would do more harm than good. Lorraine's message was clear. Harold deserved better than this. The entire Pinecrest Oaks community deserved better than this. And though he didn't know it yet, that would be the last meeting Ed Callahan shared without the looming specter of multiple lawsuits hovering above his head. The day after the meeting, a storm battered Pinecrest Oaks, hurling branches across driveways and flooding the gutters. Metaphorically, it felt like a reflection of our neighborhood's state of mind, a swirling chaos of anger, sadness, and a creeping realization that we were standing at the threshold of a legal minefield. I woke up to messages from neighbors filling my phone, screenshots of condemnation on the Pinecrest Oaks social media page, private messages from people rallying around the Henderson family, and speculation that the HOA board had hired an attorney. Even Linda Barnes, who is usually neutral on community controversies, posted that she was horrified by the heartlessness displayed on that driveway. She demanded an immediate structural reevaluation of our entire HOA leadership. It was as if an uneasy spell had broken. Folks who'd stayed silent about prior grievances felt emboldened to speak up now. Tiny cracks in the community's polished surface started to show. That day, I also received a phone call from a local reporter. The story had hit the local news, though not front-page headlines, at least not yet. Her voice was polite but probing. "Could you clarify exactly how many times you attempted CPR before Mr. Callahan intervened?" The reporter asked it so casually, I could practically see her scribbling notes on the other end of the line. The last thing I wanted was the spotlight. I still carried the guilt of not saving Harold. Talking to a reporter about it felt like pouring salt in a fresh wound. But I also realized that truth needed a voice. I took a breath, told her what I remembered, and hung up feeling like I'd just opened a small door to a huge labyrinth. By the end of that week, rumors of lawsuits became more than whispers. Lorraine Henderson was in the process of filing a wrongful death lawsuit against both Ed and the HOA board at large, citing negligence and interference in a life-saving procedure. Meanwhile, the local media picked up on the shocking details. An HOA president ordering a neighbor to stop CPR and questioned whether there was a broader pattern of overreach by HOAs. People shared horror stories of petty disputes around the country. A man fined for planting sunflowers. An elderly couple cited for leaving a wheelchair ramp unapproved. Our tragedy, though, felt infinitely more grave. I bumped into Lorraine in the grocery store aisle near the produce section. Her eyes were puffy, her expression distant. She greeted me softly. I gently expressed my condolences, but that word felt too small for the enormity of what she was going through. "I appreciate what you try to do," she told me, voice shaky. "None of this is your fault, and I know you might get dragged into it." She was referring to the legal storms swirling around. I'd heard chatter that the HOA might try to implicate me for performing CPR against guidelines, even though that was precisely the opposite of what Ed insisted. Confusion upon confusion. "Do what you need to," I said, a lump forming in my throat. "Whatever justice for Harold looks like, I'll stand by you." She reached out and squeezed my hand. I felt a pang of helplessness and heartbreak in that moment. A half hour later, as I stood in the checkout line, I overheard two neighbors talking about how the board might muzzle everyone by threatening legal trouble if we testified against them. I realized, with a sense of dread, that this was only the beginning of a very long, very messy ordeal. A few days passed before the official board notice arrived in all of our mailboxes. It was a letter on HOA stationery, the Pinecrest Oaks logo at the top in a tasteful forest green. It read, "In light of the recent tragedy, we ask our residents to refrain from making public statements that may not accurately represent community bylaws or policies. We understand the sorrow and confusion this incident has caused. However, legal counsel advises us that any public discussion of liability or potential wrongdoing could interfere with ongoing investigations. We kindly request your cooperation and privacy during this time. Sincerely, the Pinecrest Oaks HOA Board." The letter oozed corporate caution. It was also a clear attempt at damage control. Ed was nowhere mentioned by name, and not a shred of genuine remorse showed through that carefully curated prose. The reaction from the community was immediate and furious. That evening, neighbors talked openly in the streets, ignoring the board's directive. People held small gatherings in living rooms, hashing out what we could do to stand up to this authoritarian approach to neighborhood governance. Gloria dropped by my house that night. We sat on my porch swing with cups of chamomile tea, listening to the hush of the post-storm night and the hum of cicadas. She recounted bits of a conversation she'd had with a lawyer friend. "He said the HOA is probably panicking," Gloria said. "They know lawsuits are coming, and they're trying to limit the damage by telling us to be quiet." I nodded, taking a careful sip of tea. "Problem is," I replied, "we're not going to be quiet." The weight of that realization settled in the warm, humid air. Our association was no longer about block parties and holiday ornaments. Now, it was about standing up for a principle bigger than us, that the life of a neighbor was worth more than an overzealous HOA edict. And if that meant facing the wrath of the board, so be it. Gloria touched my arm. "I know Ed's out of line, but there are some powerful people on that board with deep pockets and no qualms about burying us in legal fees." She paused, face etched with worry. "Are we ready for that fight?" I didn't answer right away. I thought of Harold's widow, of the fear etched into her eyes, and the memory of pressing my palms against his chest, feeling the fragile spark of life flicker away. Then I looked Gloria in the eye. "Yes," I said, "we are." 2 months later, the legal fight was well underway. Pinecrest Oaks, once a postcard-perfect enclave, had become a swirl of depositions, court filings, and whispered strategies. The Henderson family filed their wrongful death suit, claiming interference with a life-saving intervention. Ed, in turn, hired a lawyer who claimed that the HOA president was merely cautioning an untrained responder and that the paramedics arrived quickly enough to take over. Outrage festered in the community. Several residents, myself included, received summonses for depositions. Interviews under oath about the day Harold died, about the context of the HOA's no resident intervention stance, and about Ed's exact words. It felt surreal. We'd once bonded over potluck dinners and garage sales, and now we found ourselves in austere conference rooms downtown, facing attorneys armed with tape recorders. My deposition took place on a Wednesday afternoon. The air was stuffy, and the lawyer representing Ed and the HOA had a clipped, almost condescending tone. He tried to corner me on small details. "Are you a certified medical professional? And didn't you receive only a brief training, which might have been out of date at the time?" He wanted to plant seeds of doubt about whether my CPR was truly beneficial or potentially harmful. I refused to let him twist the narrative. "I'm not a physician," I said calmly, "but I had valid, documented CPR training." And the 911 operator was on the phone, instructing us to continue until paramedics arrived. Ed told me to stop. He pressed me again, this time zeroing in on the intangible. "Could you be certain that continuing CPR would have saved Mr. Henderson's life?" I felt my heart clench at the memory of Harold's pallid face. "I can't claim certainty. But I do know that stopping it gave him zero chance. And yes, if an ambulance is en route, standard procedure is to keep administering CPR. The truth hung in the air, unshakable. Despite the attorney's attempts, I saw doubt flicker across his face. They might have corporate language and insurance disclaimers, but Ed had given a direct command to stop a life-saving measure. That was a hard fact to spin. Outside the deposition room, I waited in a corridor with a few neighbors. Some were quiet, others angry. It struck me that the board's arrogance had morphed into a legal stronghold. Pinecrest Oaks had turned into a cautionary tale about control, tragedy, and the perils of ignoring basic decency. A few weeks later, the first hearing took place. It wasn't a full-blown trial yet, more a preliminary legal battle to determine if the lawsuit had grounds to proceed. The Henderson family's attorney, a composed woman named Sarah Martinez, argued passionately that Ed's actions represented reckless disregard for human life. She had meticulously gathered statements from me, Gloria, the paramedics, and others who witnessed the fiasco. Even some board members had privately admitted to Ms. Martinez that they never wanted such a policy enforced. But the official board stance remained unwavering. On the other side, Ed's attorney hammered on technicalities, referencing internal HOA clauses that supposedly barred untrained neighbors from giving medical assistance in common areas. He insisted that Ed didn't physically prevent me from continuing. He merely verbalized concerns. I wanted to jump to my feet and shout, but I could only watch from the gallery. The judge, a graying man with an unruffled demeanor, took in both sides with a measured expression. In the end, the judge concluded there was indeed a cause of action for potential wrongful death and negligence claims. The lawsuit could proceed. A collective hush fell over the courtroom as that decision landed. Lorraine Henderson quietly placed a hand over her heart, tears brimming in her eyes. Ed and his attorney exchanged tense whispers. This fight wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time, I sensed a shift of momentum, a glimmer of vindication that maybe, just maybe, Harold's death wouldn't be in vain. Outside, the local press hovered, microphones in hand, hoping for sound bites. I saw my neighbors scurrying to their cars or forming small clusters to debrief. Lorraine gave a short statement. I'm grateful the court is letting us seek justice. Harold was a good man who deserved a chance. No one should be told to stop CPR when seconds count. I told Gloria later that evening that I wished it never had to come to lawsuits and depositions, that we could have simply had decent human compassion in that driveway. She only nodded, the skin between her brows tight with worry. HOAs weren't meant for this, she muttered. They were supposed to protect property values and keep the neighborhood looking nice, not a step between a neighbor and life-saving help. The next few days, Ed attempted a PR campaign. In an official notice posted on the community board, and ironically, on the same social media page he used to share holiday decor rules, he insisted that Pinecrest Oaks always prioritizes resident well-being and that the situation was complex. Yet, in the same breath, he also demanded no one speak to the press. It was the same controlling tone, the same fear-based tactic. But the tide had turned. Neighbors I barely knew waved at me with gratitude, praising my stance. Whispered stories emerged about Ed's past controversies. How he'd once browbeaten an older woman about the color of her front door, or strong-armed a single mother for having a kiddie pool in her yard. People had tolerated his overreach for years. Harold's death was the final straw. We were all exhausted by then, exhausted from the tension, the legal grind, the heartbreak. But we weren't giving up. A man lost his life while an HOA president barked about rules. If the court recognized the gravity of that choice, we owed it to Harold to see justice served. It took nearly a year before the lawsuits finally reached their conclusion. The trial itself was intense, with both sides drawing on medical experts, bylaw experts, and character witnesses. Cameras occasionally loomed at the courthouse entrance. For many of us, it felt like living in a slow-motion dream where the stakes were never far from our thoughts. Each day in court revealed more about the underbelly of Pinecrest Oaks leadership. Emails were introduced as evidence. some from Ed to other board members, suggesting that if they allow untrained residents to do medical procedures on HOA grounds, we open ourselves to unlimited risk. Another email had Ed bragging that he'd take the fall if needed, but the board should keep quiet. The final blow came when it was revealed Ed had once circulated an unofficial directive to discourage on-site medical intervention whenever possible, in direct contradiction to widely accepted Good Samaritan laws. Lorraine Henderson stood firm throughout, leaning on friends and family for support. She didn't want money, though damages were sought to cover hospital bills and funeral costs. More than that, she wanted accountability, a public legal admission that what happened to Harold was wrong. The day the jury returned with a verdict, the hush in that courtroom was nearly tangible. I looked over at Lorraine, her hands clasped in her lap, tears shimmering in her eyes. The foreperson announced that the HOA and Ed Callahan were found liable for negligence, contributing to Harold Henderson's wrongful death. It was like a wave of raw relief spread through everyone who had fought so hard for recognition of what was right. The judge ordered the HOA to pay damages, though the sum wasn't astronomical. Ed was required to step down from his position and barred from serving on any future homeowner association boards in the county. After years of wielding his gavel like a tyrant, it took a single court ruling to strip him of that power. The aftermath was both chaotic and healing. Some Pinecrest Oaks residents raged about the cost of the HOA, worried that their monthly dues might spike or that the neighborhood's reputation would plummet. But a good number of us saw it differently. This was a chance to reset the moral compass of a community that had lost its way. Ed sold his home a few weeks later. A real estate sign popped up on his lawn with shocking swiftness. No farewell party, no drawn-out goodbyes. Some speculated he moved to a neighboring state. Others said he simply slunk away in shame. I didn't care where he went, only that Pinecrest Oaks would never again be under his autocratic thumb. The HOA board underwent a major overhaul, with special elections held to replace the vacant seat and to address the tarnished credibility of the existing members. Gloria decided to run, along with several other residents who had once avoided the political fray. Their platform was simple: put people first. They vowed to revise the outdated, draconian bylaws, especially those referencing medical emergencies, so no one else would ever be ordered to stop CPR again. As for me, I found closure not in the courtroom, but in a small memorial garden Lorraine planted in her backyard. She invited me and a few close neighbors over to see it. At the center was a stone bench with Harold's name engraved, surrounded by marigolds and small wind chimes that tinkled softly. Lorraine explained that whenever a breeze blew, she liked to think Harold was still here, moving among us. We sat on that bench for a while, sipping iced tea, sharing memories. Some were funny, like Harold's obsession with crossword puzzles and his quips about the ridiculous lengths the HOA went to over mailbox paint. Others were tender, how he always lent a hand to neighbors in need, or the time he helped me fix my fence. We laughed, we cried. In the quiet that followed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known since that horrible day. Walking home, I realized our neighborhood was changing, but maybe for the better. Yes, property values might fluctuate, and yes, there would be continuing tensions as the new board sorted out finances. But the bigger picture was that we, collectively, had found the courage to stand up for what mattered most, preserving the humanity that underpinned this community. No rule, no bylaw, no forceful president could extinguish the basic compassion neighbors owe one another. Months later, Pinecrest Oaks held a modest memorial fundraiser in Harold's honor, raising money to sponsor CPR training classes and ADs for our clubhouse and common areas. That day, people of all ages, from teenagers with summer jobs to retirees enjoying their golden years, showed up to learn life-saving skills. A local EMT demonstrated the correct way to apply compressions, blow rescue breaths, and use an automated defibrillator. The atmosphere brimmed with purpose, as though we'd all recognized how fleeting life could be and decided never to let petty rules get in the way of saving it. Gloria, who was newly elected to the board, approached me during a break. She smiled, a clipboard tucked under her arm, the edges stacked with new HOA guidelines. "We're rewriting the medical emergency policy," she said, satisfaction lighting her eyes. "Anything we need to add?" I looked around. Neighbors practicing CPR on rubber dummies. A gentle breeze stirring the tall pines. The memory of Harold's death lingering but no longer haunting. "Just make sure it says we'll help each other. No questions asked," I replied. She nodded, writing it down. And in that moment, the hope was undeniable. We could mend Pinecrest Oaks one act of compassion at a time. What began with heartbreak ended in transformation. And if that isn't the real measure of a community, I don't know what is. The end.